The 6:14 ferry from the mainland always came in slow, dragging its wake across a harbor the color of pewter, and Imogen Ellison stood at the bow rail with her sea bag over one shoulder, and her heart doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. 11 years. 11 years of deployments folded one into the next like the pages of a book she'd never quite finished reading, and now the town of Harlow Cove was rising up out of the November mist exactly as she'd left it, the crooked spine of Chandler's shops along the front, the church tower with its weathercock frozen mid-crow, the long gray arm of the breakwater reaching out as if to catch her. She had crossed oceans she could not name on any map a civilian would recognize. She had been shot at in 3 languages, and none of it had made her hands as unsteady as they were now, gripping cold iron, while a fishing town she'd sworn she would never come back to opened its arms whether she wanted them or not. She had come home to bury the last of her family. That was the shape of it, plain and hard. Callum was already 3 weeks in the ground by the time the Navy had cut her loose from the far side of the world, and she had missed the funeral by 9 days and a broken satellite relay, and she had promised herself on the long flight back that she would not cry in front of the town that had watched them both grow up. The Ellisons did not give Harlow Cove the satisfaction. That had been their father's rule before the drink took him, and their mother's rule after, and it had become Imogen's the way a scar becomes a person's without asking. The ferry bumped the pilings. A deckhand looped a line, and down on the quay, sitting so still she might have been carved from the same wet stone as the harbor wall, was a dog. Imogen knew her at once, and the knowing went in like a blade. Juno. Her brother's dog sat at the very edge of the quay where the gangway would come down, ears up, body squared, eyes fixed on the ferry with a patience so total it looked less like waiting and more like prayer. She was a German shepherd gone gray at the muzzle now, her black and tan coat dulled and roughed by weather, one back leg held at a careful angle that told Imogen it hurt her to sit like that and that she was sitting like that anyway. Around her neck was Callum's old climbing rope, frayed to a soft gray, tied off to nothing. Nobody had her on a lead. Nobody needed to. She had chosen this spot and she was keeping it. "That your dog?" the deckhand asked, following her stare. "My brother's," Imogen said. Ah, the man's face did the thing faces did in this town when they placed her surname, softened and closed at the same time. "She's down here every day, that one, morning and the evening boat. Rain don't shift her. Folk have tried to take her home, Mrs. Peveril, the vet, the boy who does the nets. She goes back the once and then she's here again by dawn. Reckon she's waiting on someone." "She is," Imogen said, and did not say who, because who was in a churchyard on the hill and dogs did not read headstones, and the deckhand didn't need her grief and she didn't need his pity. She went down the gangway with her bag and the dog's head came round to track her, and there was a long, terrible second where Juno did not know her, where those dark eyes searched her face for the wrong person and found only a stranger in salt-stained fatigues, and then something crossed the animal's whole body like wind across water. A tremor, a recognition, not Callum, but Ellison, blood of him. "Same walk," Callum used to say, laughing, "you two even scowl the same." Juno did not leap up the way a lesser dog might have. She rose stiffly, favoring the bad leg, crossed the wet stone with her head low and her tail moving slow and uncertain, and she pressed the whole gray weight of her skull into Imogen's thigh and leaned, and stayed there, and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere under the harbor itself. Imogen went down on her heels on the freezing quay in front of God and the fishermen and the 6:14 ferry, and she broke the family rule. Just once. Just there, with her forehead against the dog's neck, both of them smelling of rope and rain and the particular loneliness of things that keep waiting after there is nothing left to wait for. "He's not coming, girl," she whispered. It's just me now." Juno pulled back and looked at her. And there was something in that look, Imogen would think about it for weeks afterward, would take it out and turn it over the way she used to turn over the last words of men she couldn't save, something that was not grief and was not welcome and was not even quite about Callum at all. It was urgency. It was a message pressed up against the glass of a language the dog did not have. You're here. Good. Now come. There isn't much time. Then Juno turned, walked 6 paces up the quay, and looked back to see if she was being followed. Imogen, who had learned in 100 hard rooms to read a body that could not speak, felt the hair rise on her arms. "What is it?" she said. The dog waited, ears forward, that held deliberate stillness. "All right," Imogen said slowly, shouldering her bag. "All right, show me." But the light was failing, and the mist was coming down hard off the water now, and a voice was calling her name from up by the harbour-master's hut. Her brother's oldest friend, Davy Marsh, hurrying toward her with his hands out and his face wrecked with the awkward business of the recently bereaved. And by the time she had disentangled herself from Davy's grief and his questions and his offer of the spare room, Juno had lain back down at the edge of the quay, in exactly the spot she'd started from, as if the moment had closed like a door. It would be 4 more days before Imogen understood that the dog had been trying to save someone's life. The Ellison house stood at the top of Gull Lane where the tarmac gave up and the gorse took over, a narrow slate-roofed cottage that had housed 4 generations of hard-luck Ellisons and now housed one. Callum had died in it. Imogen learned that from Davy, who told her with the clumsy honesty of a man who thought she'd want to know and wasn't sure. A fall, they were saying, down the cellar steps in the dark, his heart maybe giving out first the way their fathers had, found 2 days later by the postman when Juno wouldn't stop howling at the door. 34 years old. A survey boat skipper who'd never once been sick a day of his life, dead at the bottom of his own cellar stairs, and the town had shaken its collective head and said the Ellisons, that family, no luck in them, and buried him and moved on. Imogen stood in the kitchen with the electricity not yet turned back on, and the last gray daylight coming through the window, and she did not believe a single word of it. She could not have said why. It was not evidence. It was the thing under evidence, the thing the Navy had spent a fortune teaching her to trust, the animal part of the brain that counts the exits and clocks the wrongness before the conscious mind has finished being polite about it. Callum had grown up in this house. Callum had gone down those cellar steps in the dark 10,000 times. Callum's heart was a machine that had passed every medical the merchant marine had ever thrown at it. And Callum had written to her, 6 weeks before he died, an actual letter on paper, which he never did, forwarded through 3 postal systems and half a war to reach her, and the letter had said in his blunt, unpunctuated way, "Immy, something's not right down the cove side you'd not credit who's back sniffing round the old Rackmore land. Watch yourself if you ever come home. Burn this." She had not burned it. It was in the inside pocket of her jacket right now, soft as cloth from being read too many times on the flight home. She had assumed when she got the news that it meant nothing. Grief makes a detective of everyone. Every bereaved person on earth goes looking for a reason larger than these things happen. She had told herself that. She was a disciplined woman and she distrusted her own wanting. But then there was the dog. Because here was the thing about Juno that Davy mentioned in passing. Over a cup of tea he'd insisted on making on the camping stove. The thing he said as an afterthought, and she filed away like a live round. Juno didn't just wait at the harbor. Juno disappeared. Every day, in the flat dead hours of the afternoon between the boats, the dog would rise from her post and go, up over the headland west, toward the old Rackmore land where the ruined lighthouse stood. And she'd be gone 2, 3 hours, and come back wet to the belly and thin in the flank, and take up her waiting again. "Where does she go?" Imogen asked. Davy shrugged. "Nobody's followed her. Steep out that way and the path's gone since the cliff took it. Folk reckon she's just running the grief off. Dogs do, don't they?" "Dogs run in circles when they grieve," Imogen said. "They don't commute." Davy looked at her strangely. It was the first of many such looks she would collect in Harlow Cove over the following days. The look people gave the grieving Ellison girl when she said something that was too precise, too certain, too unafraid for a woman who was, as far as any of them knew, a sailor's sister who'd gone off and done some vague thing in the Navy, cooking or clerking, or whatever it was the women did. Nobody in Harlow Cove knew what Imogen Ellison actually was. The Navy did not advertise the existence of women like her, and Imogen had spent her adult life becoming very good at being underestimated, because being underestimated was, in her profession, the closest thing to body armor you could wear on your face. She let Davy think what he liked, she drank the tea, she thanked him. And the next afternoon, in the flat dead hour, she followed the dog. Juno went west along the cliff exactly as Davy had said, and she went with a purpose that put every one of Imogen's instincts on edge. This was not a dog running grief off. This was a dog with a route. She took the same line each time the ground offered a choice. She paused at the same 3 points to test the wind, and when the old coast path crumbled away into a raw scar of fallen cliff, a genuinely dangerous drop, 30 feet of loose shale into surf, Juno did not hesitate but picked her way down a goat track no human eye would have trusted, a track that Imogen, following, recognized with a cold professional respect as the only viable line down, chosen and worn smooth by hundreds of crossings. The dog was maintaining a supply route. Imogen had run enough of them to know one when she was standing in it. At the bottom, the land opened into a hidden cove the sea had all but sealed off, a shingle beach under the black bulk of Rackmore Head, and on the head itself, crouched against the sky, the ruin of the old Rackmore lighthouse. It had been dead for 60 years, its lamp cannibalized, its keeper's cottage roofless, its whole seaward flank fenced off decades ago with the rusted iron and faded warning signs of a hazard nobody could be bothered to fully demolish. It was the loneliest place Imogen had ever stood, and she had stood in some contenders. Juno led her straight to the keeper's cottage, to a doorway half-choked with bramble, and there the dog stopped. She looked back at Imogen, and then she did a thing that turned Imogen's blood to cold water. She pressed her body low, lowered her tail, and went in slowly, gently, announcing herself, the exact careful body language of a dog approaching someone it does not want to frighten. Imogen's hand went to her hip out of 11 years of habit and found nothing there but her own jacket, and she thought, with total clarity, there is a person in that cottage. "Hello," she called low and even. "I'm not going to hurt anyone. I'm Callum Ellison's sister. I followed the dog." Silence, wind, the suck and boom of the sea in the rocks below. And then from the dark of the ruined cottage, a voice, cracked, disused, hoarse with cold and something worse than cold, said one word. "Ellison." It was not a question, it was recognition, and it was afraid. Imogen ducked through the bramble into the gloom, and her eyes adjusted, and she saw a man, or the wreckage of one. He was huddled in the driest corner where 2 walls still met at a roofed angle, wrapped in a sleeping bag and a tarpaulin and Callum's old oilskin coat. She knew that coat. She'd have known it anywhere, and the sight of it here stopped her breath. He was gaunt to the point of skeletal, bearded, filthy, one leg splinted crudely with driftwood and rope. His eyes were huge in the ruin of his face, and they moved over her with the flat, exhausted vigilance of a man who had been hunted so long he'd forgotten how to stop. Beside him, and this was the detail that undid her, that reached past everything she'd trained herself into and grabbed the girl she'd been before the Navy. Beside him, on a nest of dry seaweed and Callum's spare jumpers, lay Juno's answer to the whole gray mystery of her afternoons. 4 puppies, small, blind, days old, and the man had been keeping them warm against his own starving body while the mother made the long, dangerous journey to the only place she knew still held someone worth waiting for, and brought back what scraps a morning town would leave for a stray, and shared them out a little for the man, a little for the pups, the rest of herself given to the waiting. Her secret struggle, Imogen thought, and understood at last what those urgent eyes on the quay had been trying to say. "You clever, loyal, impossible girl. You weren't grieving. You were running a rescue on your own, and it was killing you, and you came to the boat every single day hoping the one person who might help you would finally get off it. "Who are you?" Imogen said gently to the man. His mouth worked. When the words came, they came in pieces like something long broken. "Your brother," he managed, "hid me here. Callum. He was bringing me off in his boat, getting me somewhere safe, and then he stopped coming." The huge eyes filled. "He stopped coming, and I knew what it meant. And the dog kept it up on her own, 3 weeks. That dog kept 2 litters and a dead man's fool alive for 3 weeks on scraps, and his voice cracked entirely. "I couldn't even bury him. I couldn't even tell anyone. They think I'm dead. I'm supposed to be dead. That's the hole," he caught himself, and the fear came flooding back into his ruined face, and he looked at her with a naked, desperate hope that was almost worse than the fear. "You're not one of them. Tell me you're not one of them. Tell me Callum's sister is who I think she is." "Who do you think I am?" Imogen said, very quietly, and knelt down in the dirt of a dead lighthouse beside a dead man's dog and a starving ghost, and felt the whole shape of her homecoming rearrange itself into something enormous. "He said," the man whispered. "Callum said if it ever went wrong, if he didn't make it, he said there was one person in the world who could finish it, one person they'd never see coming because nobody ever did." A terrible, hopeful, breaking smile. "He said his little sister was a Navy SEAL, and God helped the men who did this when she came home." The wind moved through the roofless rooms. Juno crossed the floor and lay down between the two of them and the sleeping puppies, keeping her post the way she had kept every post asked of her by every Ellison who ever lived, and she put her gray head on Imogen's knee and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 weeks, went fully and trustingly to sleep. Because the waiting was over, because the right person had finally come off the boat. And Imogen Ellison, who had crossed oceans she could not name, who had let a town think she was nothing so that her enemies would too, looked at the wreckage of her brother's last secret and made the second promise of her homecoming. The first had been at the key, "It's just me now." The second she made silently, with her hand on the sleeping dog and her eyes on the frightened man in her brother's coat. "Whoever did this, whoever put my brother at the bottom of those stairs and left this man to die in a ruin, and let this dog carry the whole weight alone. You have no idea what just got off the 6:14 ferry." She got no name from him that first evening. He was too far gone, shaking with cold and hunger and the particular tremor of a man who has been holding himself together by pure will for longer than a body can stand. But she got the shape of the danger, and the shape of it was bad. His name was Thomas Aldous. He told her. Once she got hot food into him from the pack she'd sprinted back up the cliff to fetch. Once she'd rebuilt the splint properly and got the pup's mother fed, and the fire built small and smokeless, the way she'd been taught to build a fire when you did not want the world to know you existed. Thomas Aldous, and he'd been a marine surveyor, and 8 months ago he'd been hired by a company called Rackmore Coastal Holdings to do the seabed and geotechnical survey for a development. A vast luxury marine and resort scheme that was going to swallow this whole stretch of coast, the dead lighthouse and the hidden cove, and the veterans' allotments on the headland and half of the old town below. "And it's fraud," Thomas said, staring into the little fire. "All of it. The land itself. Half the plots they've bought were left in trust to servicemen's families after the war, protected land, can't be sold, and Rackmore forged the releases, bribed the man at the land registry, bribed the harbor authority. And the survey, my survey, they wanted me to sign off that the headland was geologically stable to build on. It isn't. It's the same fault that took the coast path. Build that marina, and in 15 years it comes down into the sea and takes people with it. But the money's already moving. Foreign money, Miss Ellison. Big money that doesn't care." "Imogen's fine," she said. "Who's Rackmore Coastal Holdings?" And Thomas Aldous looked at her across the fire and named a man. And Imogen Ellison went very, very still, because it was a name she knew. It was a name half of Harlow Cove knew, because he'd grown up here, the smooth, clever, charming boy from the big house who'd gone off and made his fortune and come back with a plan to save the town, transform the town, bring jobs and money and life. And half the town loved him for it, and the other half was too frightened of the money he waved around to say otherwise. She'd seen his face on a banner across the harbor front as she came off the ferry. Regeneration. Renewal. A better future for Harlow Cove. His smile 40 feet wide over the water. It was the name in Callum's letter. You'd not credit who's back sniffing round the old Rackmore land. It was the name of the boy who'd broken Callum's arm behind the boat shed when they were 14 and laughed about it. The name of the family who'd looked at the Ellisons for 4 generations the way you look at something on your shoe. Julian Rackmore. He found out I wouldn't sign, Thomas said, so quietly the fire nearly ate the words. So there was an accident on the survey boat, a gas bottle. I went in the water at night, 6 miles out, and I was meant to stay there. But your brother's boat was working the same water, and Callum pulled me out, and Callum hid me, because Callum had his own reasons to hate that family, and because he was a good man, Imogen. He was the best man I ever met, and Julian Rackmore found out Callum knew. And 3 weeks ago Callum stopped coming. The fire cracked. Juno's ear turned toward the sea and turned back. They think you drowned, Imogen said slowly, assembling it. They think Callum fell down his own stairs. There's no survivor, no witness, no evidence. Nobody's even looking because as far as the world knows, nothing happened at all. One dead surveyor who was never found. One unlucky Ellison, no loss to anyone. She looked up, and her eyes in the firelight had gone to something Thomas Aldous had not seen in them before, something that made him understand for the first time that the frightened huddle he'd been for 3 weeks was over, that help had genuinely come, that the tide had genuinely turned. It's clean. It's completely clean. There's just one thing wrong with it. What? They made a clean job, Imogen Ellison said, of the wrong family. She stood and banked the fire, and looked out through the roofless window at the Black Sea and the lights of the town, where a man's smile hung 40 feet wide over water, he intended to fill with fraudulent concrete and other people's graves. She had come home to bury the last of her family, and hold the family rule and give Harlow Cove nothing. She was going to give Harlow Cove a great deal. Rest, she told Thomas Aldous. Keep the pups warm. I'll bring proper food, medicine, dry kit before first light. Nobody will see me come or go, that I promise you. You've kept yourself alive 3 weeks. Give me a little while to end this properly, and you'll never sleep in the cold again. They're powerful, Thomas said. Julian Rackmore owns half the officials in the county. You're one woman. What can one woman do against? Juno lifted her head. And Imogen crouched, and put her hand on the gray muzzle of the dog who had waited at the quay every single day in the rain on a bad leg, running an impossible rescue alone, refusing to give up on the arrival of the one person who could set it right. The loyalist, quietest, most underestimated soul in the whole of Harlow Cove, who had held the line for 3 weeks past all hope, because holding the line was simply what you did. And Imogen thought that she and this dog were, in the ways that counted, exactly the same. One woman and one dog, she said, who both know how to wait and how to strike when the waiting's done. She smiled, and it was not a warm smile, and it was not for Thomas, and it was not for the town. It was for a man with a 40-foot face and no idea at all. He thinks the Ellisons are finished. Let's let him keep thinking that, right up until the moment it costs him everything. Outside, the wind came off the sea, and the old lighthouse stood dark against the stars where 60 years ago it had thrown a light to keep men off the rocks, and would, Imogen Ellison decided, throw one more. She climbed back up the killing cliff in the dark with the sure feet of long training, and behind her in the ruin, a dog watched over a sleeping man and 4 small lives, no longer alone with the weight of it. The waiting was over. The reckoning had only just stepped off the boat. The first thing Imogen did, before the town had finished its breakfast, was become invisible. Not literally. She was too well known by her surname for that. The returned Ellison girl. The one who'd gone off to the Navy and come back to bury her brother. But there is a kind of invisibility that has nothing to do with being unseen and everything to do with being dismissed, and Imogen had spent her whole adult life perfecting it. She let Harlow Cove decide who she was before she'd said 3 words to any of them, because a town that has already made up its mind about you will tell you everything while it does. So she moved through the front that morning in Callum's old coat, hunched against the cold, and she made herself small and sad and slightly lost, and she watched the town assemble its opinion of her like weather coming in. Poor thing, poor Ellison girl, no family left now. Was in the services, they say, some clerking thing I heard, cooking, you know how it is with the women. She'll not last the winter up in that damp house. She'll sell up to Rackmore same as everyone. He's offering good money, you know, very good money considering. That last one she filed away with the care of a woman handling something that might go off. She heard it 3 times before noon in 3 different mouths, and each time the same odd catch behind it, the pause of people repeating a thing they'd been given rather than a thing they'd concluded. Very good money, considering. Considering what? Nobody quite said. But she began, in the way she'd been trained to begin, to feel the outline of a thing much larger than one dead surveyor and one dead brother. A thing that had its hand around the whole town's throat, and was squeezing so slowly that Harlow Cove had mistaken the pressure for the ordinary weight of hard times. She bought bread. She bought batteries and a cheap pay-as-you-go phone with cash, then a second one. She bought from the chandlery a great deal of things a grieving woman might plausibly want: sacking, a good torch, waterproof containers, twine, and a few things she made sure to buy separately and unremarkably at the pharmacy 2 doors down: bandages, antiseptic, high-calorie supplement drinks, rehydration salts. She paid cash everywhere and she smiled at no one, and by the time she climbed back up Gull Lane she had, without a single person noticing, provisioned a field hospital. That afternoon, in the flat dead hour, she went west along the cliff again with a loaded pack, and Juno met her at the top of the goat track. The dog seemed to know her schedule now, seemed to have understood in the deep, wordless way of her kind that the arrangement had changed, that she no longer carried the whole weight alone, and together they went down into the hidden cove where the ruin waited. Thomas Aldous was stronger. Not strong. A man does not come back from 3 weeks of starvation and a broken leg in a night, but the shaking had stopped, and his eyes had lost some of the hunted flatness, and when he saw the pack come through the bramble, his face did something that was almost unbearable to watch. It hoped without flinching for the first time. "You came back," he said. "I said I would. People say a lot of things." "I'm not people," Imogen said, and set about her work. She rebuilt his splint properly. She'd done worse in worse places. And she got the supplement drinks into him slow so his shrunk stomach wouldn't rebel. And she checked the puppies, 4 fat warm scraps of life against all odds, and she checked Juno, running her hands over the dog's 2 prominent ribs and the sore back leg, and finding, under the gray, the iron of an animal that had simply refused to lie down and die. Then she sat across the small, smokeless fire from Thomas Aldous, and she took out one of the cheap phones and set it recording, and she said, "From the beginning, everything. Dates, names, every meeting, every man who took a bribe, every document they asked you to sign. You're going to talk, and I'm going to build a case that can't be broken, and while I build it you're going to stay alive and stay hidden, because a witness they think is dead is the most powerful thing in the world. Do you understand?" "You sound like a lawyer," he said. "I've had to be a lot of things." Callum never said which service. Imogen looked at the fire. Callum didn't know which service, not really. Nobody does. That's rather the point of it. She looked up. "What I'll tell you is this, Thomas. There are units whose whole job is to go into places where the enemy is powerful and confident and certain nothing can touch them, and to take them apart from the inside so quietly that by the time they realize what's happening, it's already finished. I spent 11 years doing that. And the men who trained me had a saying. She almost smiled. The confident enemy does half your work for you because he can't imagine losing, so he never looks behind him. She nodded toward the town, toward the harbor, toward the 40-foot smiling face over the water. Julian Rackmore cannot imagine losing to a dead surveyor, a dead man's grieving sister, and a stray dog, so he's not going to look behind him, and that is exactly where I'm going to be. Thomas Aldous talked. For 3 hours into the little glowing phone, he talked, and Imogen listened the way she'd been taught to listen. And the thing that came out of the dark of that ruin was so much bigger and dirtier than either of them had said aloud that even Imogen, who did not frighten easily, felt the cold of it settle in. Rackmore Coastal Holdings was the visible tip of it. Behind it sat a web of shell companies rooted through 3 tax havens, and behind those sat money. Enormous, patient, criminal money that needed somewhere clean to go, and had found it in a dying English fishing town where the land was cheap, and the officials were poor, and the only thing standing between the money and a vast laundered fortune in luxury property was a handful of protected veterans' land, a geological fault that made the whole scheme a death trap, and the inconvenient existence of anyone honest enough to say so. Callum had been honest enough to say so. Thomas had been honest enough to say so. And Callum's own reason for hating the Rackmores, the thing Thomas had hinted at the first night, Imogen dragged it out of him now, gently, because she needed all of it. It went back a generation. The Rackmore family had, 40 years ago, quietly and legally stolen the Ellisons' boatyard, the family livelihood. 4 generations of it, through a loan called in at exactly the wrong moment, a piece of engineered ruin that had put Imogen's grandfather in an early grave and her father into the bottle, and set the whole long Ellison decline in motion. No luck in that family, the town said. It had never been luck. It had been a Rackmore, doing quietly and legally to one family what Julian now intended to do to the whole town. Callum knew, Thomas said. When he pulled me out of the water and I told him who'd put me there, he laughed. Not a happy laugh. He said, of course it's a Rackmore. It's always a Rackmore. He said he'd been waiting his whole life for a reason, and now he had one, and he was going to bring the whole rotten thing down if it was the last thing he did. Thomas's voice broke. It was the last thing he did. Juno, at the word Callum, lifted her head and looked at the door and waited, and lowered it again. No, Imogen said quietly, to the dog and to the man and to her brother wherever he was. It won't be the last thing he did. He got the witness out of the water and he kept him alive long enough for me to get home. That's not the last thing he did, Thomas. That's the first move and the last thing I'm going to do. She stopped the recording. She had, on that little cheap phone, the beginning of something that would end Julian Rackmore, if she could keep the man who'd said it breathing, and keep the evidence beyond reach, and never, ever let Rackmore suspect that the grieving Ellison girl was anything at all. You need the survey data, Thomas said suddenly. My words are nothing without it. It's my professional word against theirs, and they'll bury me. They'll say I'm a disgraced surveyor who faked his own death. They've probably already built that story. But the data, Imogen, the real seabed survey, the one that proves the fault, that proves the whole headland is condemned ground. I have it. I backed it up before they tried to kill me. It's on a drive. Where? Thomas looked at her, and for the first time something like a smile, a real one, wry and half-mad and Ellison approved, crossed his ruined face. Callum hid it, he said, the night before he died. He told me if anything happened to him, it'd be somewhere only an Ellison would think to look, somewhere the Rackmores would never lower themselves to go. He shook his head slowly. He said, she'll find it. She'll know exactly where. Tell her it's where we used to hide from the tide. And Imogen Ellison went completely still, because she knew. She knew exactly where. And she understood in that moment that her brother had planned for this, had planned for his own death, and his sister's return, and the whole long game of it, had trusted, from the bottom of his own cellar stairs, or wherever they'd truly done it to him, that his little sister would come home, follow the dog, find the witness, and go, without a word needing to be said, to the one place in all the world that belonged only to the two of them. "He knew I'd come," she said. "He never doubted it," said Thomas Aldous. "Not for one second. He said you always came back for what mattered. He said it was the only thing about the Navy he actually understood, that they'd made his sister into someone who finished things." His eyes were wet in the firelight. "He was so proud of you, Imogen. Right up until the end. He talked about you like you were weather, like you were something that was definitely coming, you just didn't know when." Imogen sat in the ruin of the lighthouse with her dead brother's dog asleep against her leg, and her dead brother's witness weeping quietly across the fire, and her dead brother's absolute, unshakable faith in her sitting on her chest like a hand. And she did the maths of what he'd built. He'd got a murder witness out of the sea, and hidden him where only the dog and the tide could reach. He'd hidden the one piece of evidence that could destroy Julian Rackmore somewhere only she would know to look. He'd left the whole apparatus of his own vengeance loaded and cocked and pointed, and then he died, trusting a sister on the far side of the world to come home and pull the trigger. "All right, Callum," she thought. "All right, you built the weapon, I'll fire it. I'll get the drive," she said aloud. "And once I have it, everything changes. Right now they think there's nothing, no witness, no evidence, no threat. The moment I move on that data, the moment it surfaces anywhere, they'll know someone's alive who shouldn't be, and they'll come looking hard. So we do this in the right order. Evidence first, secured somewhere they can't reach, and copied where they can't destroy it. Then we bring in people I trust. I have people, Thomas, people who owe me, and people who hate corruption more than they fear money. And then, when it's all in place and the trap is built, and there's no way out for him, then we let Julian Rackmore find out that the wrong family got off the boat. And until then, Imogen said, banking the fire down to nothing, I am the saddest, most harmless, most easily ignored woman in Harlow Cove. I grieve. I potter about my brother's house. I let Julian Rackmore's people offer me very good money considering, and I don't say yes and I don't say no. I just look tired and overwhelmed and beaten, because a beaten woman is a woman nobody watches." She stood and shouldered the empty pack. "You'd be amazed, Thomas, how much you can get done in a place where everybody's already decided you're nothing." She was, it would turn out, entirely right about that. She was wrong about only one thing, and it was a small thing, and it would nearly cost her everything before part one was done. She assumed she was the only one in Harlow Cove who'd learned to watch quietly while pretending not to. Julian Rackmore had learned it too. The place where they used to hide from the tide was a sea cave under the eastern headland, reachable only for the 90 minutes either side of low water, its entrance a crack in the cliff you'd walk past 1,000 times and never see. As children, she and Callum had claimed it, had smuggled a biscuit tin of treasures into a high dry shelf at the back, had timed their raids against the tide tables their father drummed into them before the drink took his teaching along with everything else. Know the water, he used to say, one of the few useful things he ever gave them. The water doesn't hate you, but it doesn't love you either. Know it and it'll let you live. Imogen went at the dead low of a spring tide, before dawn, alone, with a head torch, and the tide tables burned into her the way some things never leave you. The town slept. The sea had drawn back further than it had any right to, and the crack in the cliff opened, and she went in on hands and knees through the smell of weed and salt and childhood, and at the back, on the high dry shelf where the biscuit tin used to sit, she found what her brother had left her. Not a tin, a watertight survey case of the kind Thomas Aldous would carry, and taped to the top of it, in her brother's blunt, unpunctuated capitals, in marker that had half run in the damp but was still readable, still shouting up at her out of the dark. IMMY if YOURE reading this they got me. Inside is everything. The drive proves the fraud and the fault. Tom is the witness, keep HIM alive. DONT trust DAVEY Marsh. DONT trust anyone who tells you to sell. Finish it. Love you always, your big brother C. Don't trust Davy Marsh. Imogen crouched in the cave with the case in her hands and the tide already whispering its way back in, and she felt the ground shift under the whole of the last 2 days. Davy Marsh, Callum's oldest friend, the wrecked and weeping man who'd met her off the ferry, who'd made her tea on a camping stove, who'd offered her the spare room, who'd told her she went cold, who'd told her, unprompted, the exact detail that had sent her following the dog. She disappears every afternoon. Nobody's followed her. Had he wanted her to follow the dog? Had he been testing whether she knew, or steering her toward the very thing that could get her killed so someone could be waiting? Don't trust anyone who tells you to sell. Davy hadn't told her to sell. But Davy had said, sitting in her cold kitchen, "You'll not want to stay in this damp old place, Immy. Not on your own. There's folk would give you a fair price, help you make a fresh start." She hadn't heard it at the time as anything but kindness. She heard it now for what it was. The tide was coming. She took the case and went, and she made the crack in the cliff with minutes to spare and the water at her thighs, and she came up onto the eastern beach in the gray before dawn with her brother's last message burning in her mind, and a completely new map of Harlow Cove assembling itself behind her eyes. A map in which the friends were not all friends, and the harmless were not all harmless, and the grieving Ellison girl was standing in the middle of a web she was only now beginning to see the true size of. She did not go home. Home was watched, she now had to assume. She went instead to the one building in Harlow Cove. She was certain the Rackmores would never think to watch, because it was beneath their notice in exactly the way she was. The old lifeboat station at the far end of the front, half derelict, run by volunteers, presided over by a woman named Nell Hartley who was 80 if she was a day, and had pulled more drowning men out of that sea than any soul alive, and feared precisely nothing on God's earth. Nell Hartley looked up when Imogen came through the door wet to the waist at dawn with a survey case under her arm, and she looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, "You'll be Callum's sister." The Navy won. And when Imogen said nothing, Nell Hartley nodded slowly, as if a long-held suspicion had just paid off, and said, "He came to me, you know, your brother, 2 nights before they killed him. Sat where you're standing and told me a story I didn't rightly believe about the Rackmore boy and a fraud and a man he'd pulled from the water. And he said, 'Nell, if it goes bad, my sister'll come. And when she does, you help her because she's worth 10 of me and 100 of them.'" The old woman's eyes were bright and hard as wet flint. "I've been waiting 3 weeks to find out if he was right about you. Well, girl, sit down, get dry, and tell old Nell what we're going to do about that smiling devil on the banner." And Imogen Ellison, for the second time since the ferry, felt the family rule bend, not break, just bend, because it turned out she was not, after all, entirely alone. She had a witness in a lighthouse, a dog who'd held the line, a brother's plan running like clockwork from beyond the grave, and now an 80-year-old lioness in a lifeboat shed who was afraid of nothing. Against them stood a man with a 40-foot smile, an ocean of dirty money, half the county's officials in his pocket, and somewhere in the trusted heart of Imogen's own grief, a traitor named Davy Marsh. The pieces were on the board. And somewhere across town, Julian Rackmore was about to make his first move against the grieving Ellison girl, a move he expected to be the easiest thing he'd ever done. He was going to be so surprised. Julian Rackmore's first move came dressed as sympathy, which was how she'd known it would come. He came himself. That was the arrogance of the man. He didn't send a lawyer or a runner. He came up Gull Lane in person 2 mornings later in a coat that cost more than the cottage, and he knocked on the door of the house where he thought a beaten woman was grieving, and when Imogen opened it, he arranged his handsome face into an expression of such practiced, oiled compassion that she nearly admired the craft of it. "Imogen," he said, as though they were old friends, "I am so terribly sorry about Callum. He and I had our differences as boys, but this town, it doesn't let go of anyone, does it? I wanted you to hear it from me directly. Whatever you need, my office is at your service." She let her shoulders sag. She let her eyes go tired and wet. She made herself the smallest, saddest thing in Harlow Cove, and she watched Julian Rackmore relax by degrees as he decided, exactly as she'd meant him to, that there was nothing here to fear. "That's kind," she said. "I don't know what I'm going to do, honestly. The house, everything, it's too much." "Then let me take it off your hands," he said, so gently, so reasonably. "A fair price, more than fair. You could leave all this behind, start fresh somewhere the winters are kinder." He smiled his 40-foot smile at close range. "There's nothing for you here, Imogen. Let the past go." And there it was, sell up, let it go. The exact instruction her brother had written from beyond the grave. Don't trust anyone who tells you to sell. "I'll think about it," she said, and let a tear fall, and had the satisfaction of watching Julian Rackmore walk back down Gull Lane, certain he just watched the last Ellison fold. She waited until his car was gone. Then she stopped crying, wiped her face, and got to work, because a man who thinks he's already won gets careless, and careless men leave doors open. Davy Marsh was the door. She didn't confront him. Confrontation was for people who needed to feel something. She needed to know something, so she did what she'd been trained to do, and she let him believe he was still trusted. She let Davy help her. She let him drive her to the solicitors, let him carry boxes, let him talk, and Davy, like all frightened men, talked too much and watched too closely. He asked where she went in the afternoons. He asked whether she'd found anything of Callum's, papers, that sort of thing. You know how he was, always writing things down. He asked once with a casualness that landed on her like a dropped tool, whether the dog had led her anywhere odd. So Davy knew about the dog. Davy knew Callum wrote things down. Davy was reporting. She set the trap simply. Over tea in the lifeboat station, Nell Hartley pottering in the background, missing nothing. She let Davy overhear her say, in a lowered, careless voice, that she'd found some old survey drive of Callum's and didn't know what to make of it, and that she was going to take it to the police in the county town on Thursday because something about it doesn't smell right. There was no drive going to the police. The real evidence was already copied 3 ways and sitting with a former colleague of Imogen's 200 miles away, a woman from her old unit who now worked for a serious crimes directorate and who had listened to Imogen's account with the flat attention of someone recognizing the shape of a real case. The Thursday drive was bait. And on Wednesday night, Davy Marsh, Callum's oldest friend, godfather that never was, weeper at the ferry, let himself into the cottage on Gull Lane with a key he'd kept for 20 years, to find and destroy a drive that wasn't there. Imogen was waiting in the dark of her brother's kitchen. Juno was beside her, silent, the fur standing along her spine. "Hello, Davy," she said, and turned on the light. He broke fast. Frightened men always do, once the thing they've been dreading finally arrives. It came out of him in pieces, ugly and wretched. The debts, the boat he'd remortgaged, the quiet envelope of Rackmore money that had started as "just tell me where the Ellison boy goes," no harm in it, and had ended, he swore he hadn't known. He swore it on his life, weeping now for real with Callum at the bottom of the cellar stairs. "I didn't know they'd kill him," Davy sobbed. "I swear before God, Immy, I thought it was land money. I thought he was my friend." "He was your friend," Imogen said quietly, "and you counted his money instead of him. And now you're going to help me, Davy, and it's the only thing left in your life that will ever weigh against what you did. You're going to wear a wire, and you're going to go back to Julian Rackmore, and you're going to get him talking." She looked at the wreck of the man across the kitchen. "You don't do it for me. You don't even do it for Callum. You do it so that when this is over there's one true thing you can say you did. Now sit down." Davy Marsh sat down. The confident enemy, Imogen thought, does half your work for you, and the frightened traitor does the other half if you give him a way to stop being a traitor. The evidence built like a tide coming in slow, then all at once. Thomas Aldis's survey data proved the fault. The Rackmore headland was condemned ground, and Rackmore's own engineers had known it and buried it. Davy's wire caught Julian on tape, expansive and untouchable in his own boardroom, laughing about the surveyor problem being handled, about the Ellison problem being handled, about the forged veterans' land releases, and the man at the land registry and the officials whose silence he'd bought. And through her former unit and the Serious Crimes Directorate, Imogen fed it all upward, quietly, to people far above Julian Rackmore's reach. People whose whole existence was invisible to a man who thought that owning a county meant owning the world. She kept Thomas hidden the entire time. A dead witness is the most powerful thing in the world, and she did not resurrect him 1 hour before it counted. She kept Juno's litter warm and growing. She kept being to the town and to Julian, the beaten Ellison girl who was surely, any day now, going to sell up and disappear. And she chose the ground for the ending, because you always choose the ground. Rackmore Coastal Holdings had a launch event, a great public unveiling of the marina scheme, in the town hall, press invited, the county's great and good assembled, the model of the gleaming development lit up on a plinth, Julian Rackmore at the podium in front of a banner of his own smiling face, there to announce that the last local objections had been resolved, and the transformation of Harlow Cove would begin. That was where Imogen let the tide come in. She sat in the third row in Callum's coat, small and gray and unremarkable, and she let Julian Rackmore get all the way to the good part. Let him spread his arms and promise the dying town its glittering future. Let the applause start before she stood up. "Before you break the ground," she said, and her voice was not the tired voice she'd used on him at her door. It was level and carrying, and it stopped the room like a hand on a wire. "The town should probably know it's condemned." Julian's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "Imogen," he said warmly for the crowd. "Everyone, this is Callum Ellison's sister. She's had a terrible loss. I think we can all." "The headland is built on the Rackmore fault," Imogen said over him to the room, and behind her the doors of the hall opened, and a woman in a plain dark coat came in with 2 others, and Nell Hartley rose from her seat by the wall like something the sea had sent, and the press pens started moving. The developer's own engineers surveyed it and reported it unbuildable. He buried the report and hired a second surveyor to sign a lie. When that surveyor refused, there was an accident on his boat 6 miles out at night, and he was meant to drown. She let that sit for 1 full second in the silent hall. "He didn't drown. My brother pulled him out of the water. And for that, my brother went down his own cellar stairs." The room made a sound like the sea drawing back before a wave. "This is grief," Julian said, sharper now, his charm cracking at the edge. "This is a bereaved woman making wild. Half the land you say you've bought," Imogen went on unhurried, "was left in trust to the families of servicemen and can't be sold. You forged the releases. You bribed the man at the land registry. He's already spoken to the people standing at the back of this room. You bribed the harbor authority. And 2 weeks ago you sat in your own boardroom and called my brother's murder the Ellison problem being handled." She turned, for the first time, and looked at the plain-coated woman at the door, who nodded. "There's a recording. There's the buried report. There's the surveyor." And the surveyor walked in. Thomas Aldous, gaunt still, leaning on a stick alive, came down the aisle of the town hall of Harlow Cove. A dead man walking back into the world at the exact moment he could do the most damage. And Julian Rackmore's 40-foot smile came apart on his living face in front of the entire assembled county and every camera in the room. "Hello, Julian," said Thomas Aldous. "The water didn't take me." Nobody applauded now. Nobody moved. The model of the gleaming marina sat lit on its plinth, and it looked, suddenly, like exactly what it was. A beautiful lie built over a fault, sold by a smiling man, paid for in a good man's death. Julian ran for the side door. Juno was sitting in front of it. The dog did not bare her teeth. She simply stood, filling the doorway, gray and scarred and utterly immovable, the animal who had waited on a key in the rain for weeks for the one person who could finish this. And Julian Rackmore pulled up short before her as the serious crimes officers closed the distance across the hall. And in that frozen second, the whole town watched the smiling devil on the banner brought to a stop by a stray dog he'd never once thought to fear. They took him out through the front, past his own smiling face in handcuffs. It came apart for Julian Rackmore the way it always comes apart for men who cannot imagine losing completely, and faster than anyone believed possible, because once the fault line shows, the whole confident structure comes down at once. The forged releases, the bribed officials, the buried report, the recorded boast, the resurrected witness. It was not one case but a dozen, and they took him for fraud, for conspiracy. And when the sea and the cellar and the survey boat had all given up what they'd been hiding, for the murder of Callum Ellison. The dirty money that had needed somewhere clean to go found itself in the light instead, and the men behind it scattered, and the marina that would have come down into the sea in 15 years taking families with it was never built. The veterans' land went back to the veterans' families. The headland stayed wild. The town, which had spent 4 generations saying the Ellisons, no luck in that family, had to sit with the truth that it had never been luck at all, that a Rackmore had engineered every inch of that family's ruin, quietly and legally and cruelly, and that the last of the Ellisons had come home not to be beaten by Harlow Cove one final time, but to hand it back its own stolen future. They looked at Imogen differently after that. She could feel it, the town rearranging its whole idea of her, the way she'd let it assemble a small, sad, harmless thing and now had to watch it dismantle that and build something else in its place. She was in the services. Some clerking thing, cooking, you know how it is with the women. Nobody said that anymore. Nobody knew quite what to say. They'd looked straight at her for weeks and seen nothing, and it turned out she'd been the most important person in Harlow Cove the entire time, and they judged her completely wrong. She didn't need them to say it. That was never what it had been for. Davy Marsh went to the police himself in the end, wire and all, and told the whole of it and asked for nothing. What the court would do with a man who'd sold his friend for envelope money and then helped bring the murderers down, Imogen didn't know and found she couldn't hate him the way she'd expected to. Callum, she thought, might even have forgiven him. Callum forgave everyone. It was his worst quality and his best. She left it to the law and to Davy's own nights, which she suspected would be punishment enough. The last of it was quiet, as the true endings always are. She buried her brother properly in her own way, went up to the churchyard on the hill on a clear cold morning with the whole thing finished, and stood at his stone, and finally, alone this time, with no town to deny it and no rule left worth keeping, she cried for him the way she'd needed to since the ferry. Not for the case. For Callum. For the brother who had believed in her so completely that he'd loaded the whole weapon of his own vengeance and died trusting she'd come home and fire it. Who had talked about her like weather, like something that was definitely coming. "You were right about me," she told the stone. "I did come back for what mattered. You mattered, you great fool. You mattered more than any of it." She put her hand flat on the cold granite. I finished it, Callum. You can stop waiting now. We both can." Juno sat beside her in the churchyard, gray muzzle lifted to the sea wind. And for the first time since the 6:14 ferry, the dog did not look toward the harbor, did not track the boats, did not keep her post against the arrival of someone who was never coming. She leaned her scarred old weight against Imogen's leg, and let out a long breath, and rested, because the waiting was truly over now, for both of them. And the one who'd finally come off the boat had turned out to be worth every cold hour of it. Imogen kept the house on Gull Lane. She hadn't expected to. She'd come home to bury the last of her family and leave. But you cannot always see, from the far side of an ocean, what home is going to turn out to mean once you're standing in it. Thomas Aldous mendied and testified, and stayed on to help fight the next scheme and the one after that, because there is always a next smiling man with a beautiful lie. Nell Hartley adopted 2 of the puppies for the lifeboat station and pronounced them, at 80-odd, the best crew I've had in years. Imogen kept the other 2. And Juno, Callum's loyal, impossible, unbreakable dog, who had held an entire rescue together on a bad leg, and refused to let it fail, grew fat and gray and slow by the fire in the Ellison kitchen, and lived against every odd for 4 more good years, and never once had to wait for anyone again. The town changed its mind about the Ellisons. It took a while. Towns are slow, but it got there and it earned it, and Imogen let it, because respect that's earned is the only kind worth having, and she'd never in her life had time for the other sort. She stood at her brother's window on her first true morning home, with a scarred dog at her feet, and 2 of the town's stolen futures handed quietly back, and a fault line left wild where a death trap should have stood. And she watched the 14 come in across a harbor the color of pewter, and she thought about the thing her father had told her before the drink took his teaching, the one true thing he ever gave her, that she'd carried across every ocean since. Know the water. It doesn't hate you, but it doesn't love you either. Know it and it'll let you live. The same, she thought, was true of the world and of towns and of the smiling men who ran them. The world didn't hate you and it didn't love you. It underestimated you if you let it, and if you were patient and loyal, and you knew exactly when the waiting was done and the striking began, you could let it go right on underestimating you until the very moment it cost it everything. Her brother had known that about her. Her enemy had learned it too late, and a gray dog on a quay in the rain had known it best of all. That loyalty isn't the waiting. It's who you are still standing there for, when everyone else has decided there's no one left worth waiting for.